Okay, great. Welcome everybody to the Citizen Oversight Board meeting for May 5th. I am filling in for our fearless leader as her second, I suppose. So we have a quorum, don't we? One, two. Yes, we do. So just some quick sort of housekeeping things if we can before we get to Chief Thomas. Thank you for joining us, Chief Thomas.
Sure.
Just wanted to make sure everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes from last meeting and see if we can get a motion to accept those minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, great. So we have approval on that. And then just a couple of quick announcements. I think we were already talking about Cinco de Mayo, so happy Cinco de Mayo, everyone. I think there's some great events going on around Denver. So hopefully everybody has great plans for the weekend. We also have a new board member. Is Tamisha with us? I don't think so.
Not yet.
So we'll have to keep an eye out for Tamisha Watkins, who will be joining us. So maybe at the end of the meeting, we can intrude upon her to just introduce herself, but we're excited to have another board member joining us. And then we have board elections coming up, I believe, during the July 7th meeting. And then also July 5th will mark the 20th anniversary of Paul Child's death. So we'll be thinking about how we want to address that in the July meeting, and if there's anything that we want to do about that. So with that, Daniel, am I missing anything before we get to Chief Thomas? Okay, so Chief Thomas, thank you for joining us. I think we sent the questions that we had already written over to you. So I didn't know, whatever works for you, I can ask the questions, or if you want to read them and kind of start at the top, or whatever you want to do.
Well, whatever works for you. I mean, I think I'm prepared to to answer each of the questions that were sent over.
Well, great. Then I'll turn it over to you. And
Okay.
if you have any questions or anything, please pop back to me.
Okay, so I think the first question related to recommendations in the annual report. And so I think, before I go through, each recommendation and the response, I'll just say that, fundamentally, I think there's agreement with each of those recommendations. I think we are either already there or certainly moving in that direction as it relates to those recommendations. So I'll start first with recommendation number 1, which relates to the use of force board. And I just want to let everybody know that we are actively researching the proposed changes to the use of force board, getting some feedback from community members. I've met with a number of community groups, as well as the Chiefs Advisory Board, other subject matter experts in our legal counsel, just to identify how to best move forward and increase engagement and transparency. So more to come on that, but I think at the bottom line is, we agree that we need to increase the number of citizen participation in that process, and so we plan on moving that way very quickly. Have already had some preliminary discussions with the Office of the Independent Monitor. So again, more to come. Recommendation number 2 relates to our community engagement, and again, agree that that's an area that we needed to improve upon. We actually had moved that direction, I think, pretty significantly since I took over as Chief of Police. We've just recently hired a new civilian director to oversee our community engagement efforts. This allows us to better coordinate our various programs and activities. We're also working to explore ways to centralize our information so that's much more easy for public consumption. I know that each of the districts publishes information on their various web pages and Nextdoor sites. And I know headquarters does the same, but I think it's reasonable to kind of house much of that information in kind of one location. So we're looking at creating a dashboard, much like some of the other dashboards that are now available on the main DPD webpage. Recommendation number 5 is relative to communication on internal investigations. And so again, talking about dashboards, we are now publishing IA complaint information on our performance and transparency dashboard, which I think increases access to this particular information. Recommendation number 6 relates to information sharing. And I think a lot of this relates to information related to specific cases. My understanding is there's already been an agreement from 2021 for us to set up an account with OIM on evidence.com through which we can share all of the relevant documents, much like we do already with this DA and City Attorney's Office. In terms of information sharing relative to critical incidents and other significant activity, we already do public briefings often at the scene of these incidents, and then I think after we gather more facts, I think we try to be very quick about when we're in control of the investigation. We try to be pretty quick about providing a public briefing relative to what happened in those particular instances. Recommendation number 7 relates to reducing arrests and diversion in appropriate situations. Here we work very closely already with our safety and city partners and other community organizations to ensure that individuals get access to the care that they need. I think that we lead, in terms of providing alternative response, whether that's through co-responders, outreach case coordinators, the STAR band. I think that we also have identified a number of diversion opportunities. Certainly the AIDS Center. We've revamped and revitalized our LEAD program, and so this is something that I think that we are committed to. Providing diversion opportunities for individuals that we come into contact with, particularly those that have been involved in low-level crimes. And so I think you can see us continue to commit to that particular initiative. And I think that was it as it related to the annual report. And so the next question related to the status of our Before the Badge program. And I may have provided information on this in previous COB meetings, but the Before the Badge concept in my mind is something that I identified from another jurisdiction. Actually, it was Seattle Police Department, where we want to provide new officers sort of a grassroots experience to acclimate them to the communities that they'll ultimately be out serving prior to them, becoming a full-time police officer. And so where we are with this particular program is because it took a while to develop, the model that we're currently using. The class that is graduating in June, we will have them go through this program before they start their field training. So a huge thank you to Together Colorado and the Denver Dream Center for their partnership on this project. So we really think that we are going to be able to give them pretty wide breadth of experience with various communities in each part of the city, so that they kind of understand some of the challenges, some of the historical mistrust or distrust, and which I think will be helpful as they acclimate into their assignments before they start their field training. the class that will be starting in just a couple of weeks, later in May. We're going to do that actually at the very beginning of the academy. So before they start their traditional academy training, we're going to give them this same indoctrination. I think that's preferable, but we weren't able to develop it to my satisfaction before we seated the class that's about to graduate in June. So that's why we'll be doing it post-graduation, but going forward, our plan and desire is to do it pre-academy.
Chief Thomas, if I can jump in with just a question about that.
Yes.
You mentioned that the class in June is going to be participating in, I guess, kind of two things. One is the plan for this to be mandatory and like part of the training before they get onboarded? And then I guess tangentially, I mean, you mentioned some of the partners that the police department is working with, but what does that like physically look like when you say like they go out into the community? If you have like an example of something that these trainees would be up to.
I can send you an agenda, but so the classes that is graduating in June, they are going to spend that first week before they get in a police car and patrol. They are going to be visiting each segment of the city and engaging with community members and various community groups in those parts of town, having difficult conversations and giving them that opportunity to identify other people's lived experience and see things through their particular lens. And then this next class that starts in May, I mean, they will be hired members of the Denver Police Department seated in our academy, but before we start our traditional academy, we're going to go through this program, and so they will be taken by bus to the various parts of town to have these engagements. And so it is mandatory. So it is something that every member of our graduating class in June and every member of the class that we seat in here in a couple of weeks, it is something that they will have to go.
Thank you. And then not to derail the train here, but we had a question about if you could, just kind of backing up a little bit. You talked about the LEAD program, the revamped LEAD program. Can you speak a little bit more to that?
LEAD, law enforcement assisted diversion, and so that's a program by which officers come into contact with someone that is engaged in a low-level crime. I think that the crimes that are most often associated with the LEAD program are minor drug possession cases, prostitution, sex offenses, and minor thefts. And they basically, the concept is to basically provide them sort of a warm handoff to someone that's going to address or help them address whatever their issue may be. Food insecurity for those people that are arrested for or contacted for a theft, substance misuse issues for those people that are arrested for or contacted for drug situations. And I think we've been committed to this program for a while, but I think the capacity issue has made it difficult to provide that true warm handoff. But the opening of the AIDS Center, I think, has been very beneficial to us. Having a place it I think has increased our ability to truly create that warm handoff situation. And so it's just, again, part of our commitment to really want to recognize that there are issues that I think cause people to engage in low-level crime, and rather than put them in jail, we feel like helping them address those concerns is the better way to go.
Question,
Yes.
Chief, under the, what you're calling the low-level crimes, what kind of services or handoff would occur with regard to sex offenses, and what would that include?
So, I mean, I would have to have our lead program manager probably would be the best one, Tien Tong, who I think would be the best one to answer that question. But I think that that many of our sex workers are victims of crime, have suffered significant trauma, and so putting them in a program to help them process and address that trauma is what we find to be beneficial. And so again, TM would probably be the better one to provide a lot of detail about what exactly that looks like.
Okay.
And Karen, I can have TN reach out to you and the board with information on that question.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I had the same question as Karen. I'd be interested in that too. And talking about that, sex offenses being low level, that caught my attention. And there must be a certain category there.
Great. So I think maybe just moving on to the that last question, Chief Thomas. Thank you.
As it relates to Halo cameras, so so in terms of where they're placed and decisions made on placement of Halo cameras, so the majority of these cameras were placed in preparation for the DNC. And we do add new cameras as we're able to, and those additions are always based upon crime data information as it relates to volume of pedestrian and vehicle movement. Also the volume of special events that would occur, say like in Civic Center Park or something like that. Also the potential for locations to be homeland security targets. And then other considerations by those affected district commanders, where it's identified usually through community input that there's a need for Halo cameras. And then there is for many of our cameras, there is sort of a constant revisiting to identify whether or not it's still necessary to maintain cameras. Often we will have cameras placed in a location because of significant drug activity or violent gang activity. And then when that activity subsides, then we reevaluate and usually move those cameras to somewhere else where it's needed. And then the next question is, are these cameras actively watched, or are they only reviewed in response to a reported incident? And so we do have near 24/7 coverage in our real-time crime center. And so there are a number of cameras that are actively being watched. Usually that depends on calls for service data, significant incidents that are occurring at known times. And then they also listen to the radio, all channels. And so they will move cameras if they need to in order to capture events that are in progress, just to provide as much relevant information to responding officers as possible. And then is the real-time Halo camera footage only available for crime-related calls, or is that footage available for medical, fire, other types of emergencies? The answer to that is yes, it is available for all of those other situations, with the caveat being that that footage is only remains for 30 days, so it's overwritten in 30 days. But if there's a specific incident, whether it's a criminal incident or a medical incident, a fire, some other kind of emergency response incident, all we need to, we just need to be contacted in order to flag that particular footage, and it can remain indefinitely, usually until the closure of that particular case.
Chief, I had a couple follow-up questions on that, but I don't want to interrupt you.
Well, and I think I'm about done. So just to clarify that the retention of Halo camera footage is governed by strict city policy, and that policy is reviewed and vetted by the Chief Data Protection Officer for the city.
If somebody wanted to get that Halo camera footage prior to the 30-day expiration date for a non-criminal incident, would they have, you mentioned it's subject to city regulations, but they have to serve a subpoena to get it? They couldn't just make an informal request the police department to get it, or could they?
So I think you could make a CORA request. You wouldn't have to subpoena it. You could just make a just a simple CORA request, and hopefully either it would be within those 30 days, or hopefully it relates to a situation that where we flag that particular footage so that it could be retained long term.
Okay. My second question with respect to Halo cameras relates to something you said early on about it, and that is the connection between perhaps an area of focus for the Department of Homeland Security. Can you give a little bit more detail on that? In the areas that the Department of Homeland Security may be interested in activity there, or
Yeah.
maybe
So as I said, much of our Halo camera network was put in place in preparation for the Democratic National Convention, and so there was an awareness of where certain activities would take place. Civic Center Park being one, the area around Mile High Stadium being another, and so and then there are other, I think targets, city and county building, state capitol. So there are I think targets that I think are of interest to Homeland Security, that where our Halo cameras are most often focused. Traffic cameras are also tied into our Halo camera network, and so many of the major thoroughfares, Colfax Avenue, for instance, we're able to tap into those traffic cameras. Those cameras, I think it's important to clarify, traffic cameras don't typically record unless you set them to record, and I think traffic management only allows for a certain number of them to record. So if we wanted to record an event that was happening at a specific location that was covered by a traffic camera, we would have to identify that particular camera as one that is recording during that time. Otherwise, their view cameras only and not recorded.
Okay. I guess when you said Department of Homeland Security, I was more associating with that with perhaps immigration offenses and the like, but you were.
Oh, no. This is more just kind of targets that I think, threat targets.
Got it. Okay. That's helpful. Thanks for the clarity.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I thought, Karen, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Any other questions for Chief Thomas while we have him? Thanks for joining us, Chief Thomas.
Certainly.
Not seeing any other questions or anything in the chat. So thank you for joining us, Chief Thomas. I as always, really appreciate updates from you. You're welcome to stay. It's a public forum, but I'm sure you're very busy. So then I think our next agenda item is just a check-in with Liz Castle. There were some updates that you wanted to provide us, Liz.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning.
Just briefly, after a long process, we finally did hire an intake coordinator that will be a dedicated person to triage our receive complaints, our calls. And she will be beginning on May 15th. That is her start date. She's currently working for the city in another capacity and has been working with the city for 17 years. So we're very excited to have her come on board. With regards to the OIM outreach youth program, we do have a couple of forums coming up. One is next week on the 9th, and the other one is on the 11th at DCIS Baker, which is Denver Center for International Studies, 547 West 6th Avenue. So those are two separate forums that are coming up next week. And we also have moved forward, and we have, and I apologize, I don't have the date. We have a, I believe, scheduled an all Black forum here in the future, and a Spanish, completely Spanish forum also. And I apologize, I will update you on those dates. That's all I have.
Perfect. Thank you, Liz. And then I think our next agenda item, Daniel, you had some board business for us.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Couple of things to open up for board discussion. The first was interest in well, they're all sort of potential board activities. One is interest, just wanting to gauge interest in a potential tour. If we want to request a tour of the county jail facility over on Smith Road, so a bit northeast of downtown. They are going to be opening up, I believe, a contact visitation, not center, but starting contact visitation there, and opening up a new part of that facility, a new renovated part of that facility. If board members have interest over the summer, so if board members have interest in touring that facility, just wanted to gauge that. And then also, I know we have scheduled to meet with 911 director Dameron in June, and was wondering if I wanted to gauge board interest in potentially setting up a visit to the 911 call center around that time this summer as well, sort of correspond with that meeting with director.
I'm interested.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in both of those.
I'm interested.
Great. I'm assuming a weekend would work best, maybe a Saturday morning. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, for me, whatever works for everyone else, I'll move things around.
Yeah. Can we have any of those during our regular board meeting? I know it's where we could do that.
There's a possibility. Our mid-June board meeting, we were planning on meeting with community members in the East Colfax community. I have not yet been able to nail that down with them. So there's the potential that, if they aren't available at that time, we could cancel that meeting and instead convert it to a visit of a city facility. Otherwise, most of our meeting slots are spoken for.
Or what? I'm sorry.
Are spoken for.
Oh.
Fair enough.
Cool.
And
So
maybe-
I will
I was just
Sorry?
saying maybe like a doodle poll or something for availability
Sure.
or
No, I
something.
can do that. Just wanted to get a brief gauge on
Sure.
whether there was interest to pursue that. So happy to chase that down a bit. The next potential activity was the Juneteenth Music Festival. That's on the June 17th and 18th. And I believe Juneteenth then is the 19th, the Monday. So there is an opportunity, they have a music festival on Welton Street in 5 Points neighborhood. And so there's an opportunity to host a booth there. And wanted to do a quick gauge of board member. I had mentioned it previously when we were talking about the Cinco de Mayo event, and wanted to gauge board member interest in that, and whether I should also, send out a doodle poll and chase that down a little bit more in terms of, active scheduling to cover those times.
COIM would be interested in joining also with COB on that.
I'd be interested.
Would love to do it.
I'm
Did you say
interested.
June,
I think I might be out of town. I'm not sure yet.
June 17th, you said, Daniel?
17th and 18th, yes. I do not
Okay.
think they are as strict as Cinco de Mayo Festival is on, requiring full coverage for the, all day, both days. I have reached out to them though, and I'm waiting to hear back on a couple of things. So I can keep you posted on, some of the terms and conditions as I receive them.
Sounds good.
If I'm in town, I can definitely go.
Great. And, having a little bit more advanced warning than the Cinco de Mayo event should help smooth a lot of things out. So,
And the lack of 24-hour coverage, yeah.
yeah,
I'm joking, not 24, I was exaggerating.
It was
Yeah.
actually
it was 20.
48, Stefan.
Yeah,
Um,
only 18 hours.
Close enough. The last thing that I sorry, Karen, go ahead.
I was gonna say, there's also the Black Arts Festival and the Cherry Creek Arts Festival.
Yeah,
And when are those?
I
At the
think they're
same-
both in July.
Okay,
one I believe is July 4th weekend. I believe that's the Cherry Arts Festival. Don't quote me on that, but.
No, you're right, Anna, you're right. It's always over the July 4th weekend, the Cherry Creek Arts
It's
Festival.
always on the July.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's always on the July 4th weekend.
do we want to try to prioritize one of those events of those three? If they're all sort of in the mid-June to early July timeframe. I don't know that we have the capacity to do all of the above. Do any board members have preferences for which ones to try to prioritize?
I just love the diversity between the two, and if we can get attendance at both, that would be awesome. I'll do the Cherry Creek Arts Fest. And Juneteenth, no problem doing that. I'm all good.
I'd be up for doing both.
Anyone else want to join us?
Yeah, I mean, I could, depending on the times, I could do both, depending on how the coverage.
Yeah, if we, during our session, if we can just break out our times and commit to a certain time frame for coverage.
OIM would be interested in joining as well.
That'd probably be July 1st and 2nd, I believe, is the weekend right around July 4th. Oh yeah, so Cherry Creek Arts, I just pulled it up. July 1st, July 2nd, July 3rd.
Oh, good.
So that's into Monday.
I mean, I could probably do part of Cherry Creek. It just depends. I mean, I'll just be finishing moving, and for Juneteenth, I may be in Florida for some odd reason, and I really don't want to go, but I'll figure it out.
And I can dive into their website and some of their terms and conditions as well, and just make sure that logistically that will work.
Well, if I go to Florida and you don't see me after that, send help.
Okay. Sounds like fun.
Okay, so that's
Oh,
then
no.
four different events to do some scheduling for. So you will be receiving emails. Please take the time to get this filled out when you can, and we can proceed from there. Finally,
And Daniel, and we have, I know, can just confirm this, we'd have a booth with an umbrella because it is hot.
Yeah.
At these festivals.
so we do have a canopy,
yeah.
canopy tables and chairs. I do not think we will have, a power source for a fan. So you would need to bring sort of a battery powered thing or a cooler full of water, ice, but there would be canopy for sure. The last thing to discuss on my list is board budget. And so the budget requests are due at the end of next week. There's a form that I can fill out for each one that we might make. We had previously talked about a request for additional funds to cover the increased cost of board member stipends, given the recent ordinance change. And I've started, drafting that sort of the formal document request. Pardon. Julia had mentioned to me briefly before she left for this week to be out of town, possibility of a budget request for additional funds to do more sort of hire an academic researcher, to give the board the flexibility to work with sort of academic researchers on various projects in the future. At this point, I don't really have the specificity to make a strong budget expansion request. But if that's something that the board does have additional ideas or thoughts on, and not every budget request has to be the strongest, just wanted to open up for discussion as to whether that's or if there's another option that the board would want me to sort of work on the official paperwork for.
Daniel, can you share the existing budget so we could see what's already in there?
Yes, I can pull that up right now, actually. Give me one moment, please. Okay. All right, I think I've pulled this up. So we have here our baseline funds up at the top is currently just over 38,000. With the new board member stipends, stipends will take up approximately $20,000 each year. They went from $1,200 per board member per year to, and it depends again, to a per meeting basis. So, if we cancel meetings, it'll be less. If we have extra meetings, it'll be more. But assuming full attendance, perfect attendance, and, a full schedule of board meetings, it would be close to $20,000 per year for just for stipends. NACL travel
Yes.
is sort of the second big ticket item, depending, and that really depends on how many board members want to go. we have had quite a few new board members in the past couple of years join. And the bylaws recommend attendance at least once. And so that can be, I've estimated here on this screen, 2,500 per board member. So that would include flights, hotels, registration, per diems, and travel reimbursements. And it, could easily be less than that. I just wanted to, make sure that for budgeting purposes, we're setting aside enough funds there. And then, and registration for that will open here in, I think, 2 weeks.
Okay.
So I can get some clarified numbers there. But that's the second big sort of line item, which leaves the board with approximately, under the current budget, leaves the board with approximately $7,000 or $8,000. Currently, we have for this year, we've dedicated a good chunk of that to the promotional video that we're currently working on. Some of that was paid with last year's funds. The majority of it is paid with this year's funds. And then we have down at the bottom, you can see approximately $2,000 left this year. And so there's not a lot of flex. So if we want, interpretation services, we want, various event costs could be $500 per event, just for the booth space. It's not a lot of wiggle room this year. And so next year, assuming we get the increased stipend, the $10,000, $11,000 here for increased stipends, that would, and yeah, some of the tightness this year is due to trying to cover increased stipends with existing operating funds. And so there's additional tightness there. So if we do receive that increase, which I think there's a strong case to be made there, that would give the board approximately $15,000, because the video cost is non-recurring, plus the additional 10,000 would give the board approximately $15,000 in flexibility, depending on NACL travel. If fewer board members want to go, we could have some additional funds there and those funds could be used to engage an academic researcher, but it would be trade-offs there. So if we wanted to hire another facilitator for another strategic planning meeting or retreat, that would have to come out of those funds as well.
Have we discussed how many board members want to attend NACL this year? So we can start allocating and planning?
I have sent out some preliminary feelers. I know 2 or 3 board members have mentioned to me that they're interested. Registration has not opened yet. We don't have a schedule of exactly what the sessions will be. And it is still early to be making, it's always tricky with board members. We've had board members in the past say they want to go, and then work comes up. It's a 4-day travel commitment. So Sunday through Thursday, it's significant. And as a board activity, it's a secondary priority. And so it's always a little tricky to nail down this early in the year.
And it's in November this year, right?
It is November, I believe it's 11 to 14 is my
12 to 16.
12 to 16. There you go. Thank you, Larry.
Okay.
12 to 16 in Chicago.
Okay. Well, just for employment's sake, right? To be able to request those days off and put vacation time in. Okay. I'll be in touch. Thank you.
So it's, and that's something that is being addressed in the new bylaws, as well as, less of a requirement, more of a encouragement, acknowledging that it is a significant ask. It's a significant sacrifice for people who are doing this, essentially voluntarily. So.
And and pardon my questions, I don't want to take up too much time here, but with NACOL, are we paying for that upfront out of pocket with the travel expenses and then we're reimbursed through the COB? Or is that, are you like
happy to talk
here
through
with the
that.
budget? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So travel expenses, so flights, hotels, conference registration. So that's the bulk of the costs.
Right.
I purchase with a city card.
Okay.
And you don't have to deal with at all. You give me the information and the flights you want, and I book them. There are certain parts that are reimbursed. So you are eligible for reimbursement for transportation to and from airports. So the airport in Chicago, the airport here in Denver, you would pay that out of pocket and then be eligible for reimbursement if you provide receipts or documentation.
Sure.
And so and then per diems, so food and miscellaneous expenses during that time are reimbursed afterwards, but you do not need receipts for that. It's a flat rate per day based on, the hotel provides breakfast. So there's a flat rate for lunch and dinner. One night there is a dinner provided. So that's not included. We go through and it's usually approximately $250, I think, just in sort of food and miscellaneous costs reimbursement.
Okay.
But so travel to and from the airport and sort of food and miscellaneous expenses during those 4 days, those would be reimbursed after the fact. And it does take about a month to get that reimbursed. So
Okay.
it's not an immediate,
Right.
But the bulk of the expenses are done. I purchased them for you. So
Thank you.
That's how that works.
Okay.
So then, Daniel, just in terms of sort of like your bigger question, are you needing something from the board in terms of Julia's sort of like, I guess, I don't know if it was a request to submit an expansion?
Yeah.
Board compensation or?
I'll be talking with Julia. I have a meeting with Julia scheduled for Monday.
Okay.
She'll be back in the country. We'll talk about it more. I just wanted to, given that we won't have another board meeting prior to the deadline for expansion requests, I wanted to put it out there and see if the board had any particular feelings about absolutely go for it, even if it's not, the most detailed or strong request versus, maybe we can wait until, we have a more particular project that we're looking for. It's different. You can make a lot of requests and hope they say yes to a couple. You can also, wait and try to, keep your powder dry or wait and just try to make strong requests that are going to get approved, or at least that you can, really make a strong case for getting approved. It's really a board decision. And I'll talk to Julie about it and we can do that, but I wanted to at least open it up if board members had comments or opinions that they wanted to share on that, or additional requests for additional projects to make requests on. So,
I mean, I'd like to see some money to help support ongoing outreach. I mean, you mentioned the different events, but things related to that, whether it's printing costs, stuff to hand out at the tables and stuff like that. Some marketing I think is important. Also, like this wouldn't happen next year, but like we had talked about the possibility of hosting a mayoral forum, monies to help facilitate something like that. I don't know like where we would tap into that if that would have been a restriction this year or not.
That
Yeah, I
would be
think,
awesome.
I think with our, if the board is committing to, participating in, say, 6 to 8, hosting a booth 6 to 8 times a year or something like that with our new community outreach plan that we're working on. That's something certainly that we can fit it in the budget and say, hey, 6 times, let's say an average of $500 per booth plus miscellaneous expenses. That's $3,000. If that's going to be if the board anticipates that being a recurring, line item, that they want to expand the outreach efforts and activities. I think that's something that we could do for sure.
What is your feeling? You said that Julia had raised adding some money to the budget for research projects. I mean, what's your view on that, Daniel, in terms of your bandwidth to do those sorts of research projects? You feel like if the board had specific additional, projects that would be something that you would feel that you could handle or that you could use help? I mean, one area, for example, is, and Terrence sent around a link about the use of AI, for example, across law enforcement use of AI across the country. I think that Aurora has used it or is using it as well. So it's an interesting topic. But I mean, that's something that the board might be interested in knowing about and being proactive. I'm sure that the police department is also, I know they're not doing it now, but it may be looking at it. But that's just an example of a project. What's your feeling about your bandwidth and capacity on those things?
I think it really depends on the project in terms of skill level. I am happy to do a fair amount of, shall we say, regular data analysis. I can do some data visualization, but if we're actually talking about, doing a study, creating some sort of study, doing, I would say probably anything sort of low level skill wise, I'm happy to do. That also sort of caps the amount of time. If it's something that I have the skill to do, I think I also probably have the capacity to do it, to fit it in. Any sort of medium-sized projects, the OIM does have a policy team with people who are much better at data and statistics and analysis than I am. So I would want to, check with them and see if they have the, that might be something they already have done or can do much easier. Depending on their capacity. They might be working and busy on other things.
Nicole has a lot of, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say, OIM staff, even though they have more skill than me, and that may be busy doing other things. And so then I would say, if it's a bigger project or something that OIM doesn't have capacity for, that's where I would really, consider or recommend looking for outside services, whether it's just a consultant to help, we have the data, please do this work on it, versus, we have an actual study that we want to commission that is going to take some time to actually, design and execute and then analyze. So it really depends on the type of work that we want to do.
Yeah, got it. And Nicole has a lot of some resources too, when they're looking at areas of civilian oversight that impact, various cities across the country. So
yes,
I don't feel strongly about that. Then, I mean, it's almost like a case by case basis, and we don't have anything immediately in mind. I mean, but perhaps others do.
Anyone else? You don't have to have an opinion, but anyone else have anything they want to share on the budget front?
I mean, I would defer to you and Julia, and certainly if she has something in mind where she wanted to ask for an increase for some sort of certain study, and I echo Larry's sentiments that if there was some increase to help with outreach type stuff, that makes a lot of sense. But I think at this point, just because I understand that you're sort of asking for instructions just because it's due soon, I think it makes sense to submit what you think's reasonable, and then we can circle back at the next board meeting to just kind of unpack what you and Julia decided to submit, and you know, I don't know if at that point you'll know if you had approval or where we're at with that.
No, the budget calendar, you make your expansion requests, and this year they're moving it up as well because of the mayoral transition. The new
Right.
mayor will ultimately be deciding the budget proposal. It's a little different for us. It's a slightly different process because the OIM does not, our budget is folded into the OIM's budget.
Okay,
And the OIM no longer reports to the mayor.
okay.
And so I'm not the expert on that. But there's a little bit more freedom there in terms of the budget process, but requests are due this year in mid-May. You know, the new mayor will come in July. There's a couple of different layers of, you know, the budget management office goes through and is like, you know, just right off the bat, sort of filters out some requests, you know, accepts others and to move forward. But then, you know, it's just going to be very interesting. Once the new mayor comes in, they get their team in place, their priorities in place. There may be a lot of there's a potential for, you know, things that were not moved forward to change in the final budget. But the final budget will be proposed, I believe, in September. Council will look at it, they'll send it back. And then I think the final is usually in November, I want to say.
Got it.
Okay.
And that's calendar year. So the calendar year and fiscal year are the same for the city. And yeah, so and I did just remember one other thing, Stefan and Terrence, do we have any progress or any update on the potential bylaws language regarding conflicts of interest and disclosures?
Yeah, I've worked a little bit on that, and I thought Julia had talked to you about that, Dan.
I know she mentioned, you know, we're not gonna vote on anything until
Right.
A little later on. I was just wondering if there was anything
Yeah,
that you
well,
wanted to discuss.
Not at this time.
Great.
But I've looked at it. I raised a particular issue with Julia, and then I was going to coordinate with Terrence, but it's a little premature. Yeah.
Sure. Just wanted to check in. I think that concludes the open meeting portion agenda. Liz, I do believe there were a couple of executive session eligible matters that you wanted to discuss with the board. Is that correct?
Yes.
Excellent. And upon a motion and a second and a vote, we can adjourn to executive session.
Yes.
I'd move or second.
Second and I.
Great. All in favor of moving to executive session? Aye,
Aye.
great.
Aye.
That's everybody. I did get an email from Tymisha Watkins, the new board member, that she was pulled into a work meeting, unfortunately, this morning. She may be able to join us for executive session, but her public introduction will have to wait. So thank you all, and we'll see you soon.